Hello, listeners, and welcome back to Align, Engage, Fulfilled, where we are well into our season on engagement. Now, we've looked at this from the perspective of leadership. We've talked about the hard side of engagement with compensation and value with Vicky, and we've talked about the soft side of humor and connection with Kevin. But there is a fundamental truth we haven't touched yet. You cannot engage someone if you're only talking about yourself. Now, my guest today calls himself a growth story architect. He argues that most companies are failing at engagement because they're shouting at people rather than building with them. My guest is the founder of Standpoint and the author of the international bestseller, Storybuilding. In this episode, we're going to explore why storytelling is often just a fancy word for marketing noise and how shifting your standpoint is a secret to capturing attention in a crowded world. Please welcome John Elbing, joining us all the way from what a lot of people know as the happiest place on earth. And no, I'm not talking about Disneyland. I'm talking about Switzerland. Welcome, John, and happy to have you on.
Hi, Clarence. I'm really happy to be here, and that was a great intro. I'll use that. I mean, that was
Yeah,
really
of
great.
course.
So yeah,
Thank you. I worked hard on that for you.
okay, thanks.
All right, John. Well, I want to start with a common enemy that too many of us are so familiar with: corporate narcissism. It's this default setting where companies think that the market cares about their story, their awards, and their internal processes. You wrote in one of your works that customers don't care about you, they care about how you make their lives better. Now, this seems obvious, yet 90% of websites that I visit, and I'm sure for those of us listening, the same is true for you, are still talking about themselves. They're still talking about the story of the business. Why is this company centric default so hard to break? Why do smart leaders intellectually understand that they need to focus on the customer, but emotionally struggle to stop being the hero of their own story?
Well, I like you use the word hero because somehow in the story, your customer should be your hero. If you're
Right.
the hero, they'll feel like where do I fit in?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, I guess that there's a it's a fallback. You sort of say, what do I say? And, the worst is, we have 5 departments. So on the website, we'll put 5 little categories and you can go
Huh.
see what we do because it's straightforward. You don't really have to think. So maybe the product people were, very clever in building those products so that they would, meet a need and solve a problem. But then once you go out, you talk about how many pixels you have and how
Right.
all this stuff. And then, people don't recognize themselves in that, and they feel like, yeah. I haven't used that much, but this idea that they feel shouted at, just say, "Look at me, look at me, look at me,"
Right.
and we should look at them.
Yeah, absolutely. It almost becomes kind of like a networking experience. I mean, for those of us who have gone into networking events, we know that people love to talk about themselves, and some of us are guilty of that ourselves. We talk about ourselves when, in fact, this much of the success that people get is from letting other people talk about themselves. But that's not the same, or that's not true in the context of telling your brand story, right? You almost have, or not almost, you have to flip the script and not talk about yourself and allow the story to really be built around a shared experience.
Yeah, the subtitle of the book is "Stop Talking About You." Yeah, even in a networking event, if you come and say, "I do this," people say, "Oh, that's great. I'll go get a drink." But somehow, if you say, I did a little kind of networking teaser for some people, and one of the things was say, "Who do you help?"
Mm,
And instead of saying what you do, you talk about who you help. And
mm,
that makes it really more engaging. So the
yes.
next time someone asks you what you do, you say, well, these people have this aspiration, this challenge, and I help them somehow.
Yeah.
And that's a lot more engaging because you turn around and take their standpoint, get into
Right.
their shoes. Um, yeah, and then the bigger the corporate, the harder that is to sort of get down to the level of your customer somehow, I guess.
Right. Yeah. Well, I want to get specific about the word storytelling because I have a bone to pick with my own industry here. Before I left the 9 to 5 grind to start my consulting firm, I was a CMO. I was a chief marketing officer in the healthcare space. And throughout my marketing career, I always felt that this buzzword of storytelling was really just a modern version of marketing as a megaphone. It's become a popular mainstream concept, but it still approaches marketing as a one-way street. As we established earlier on in the beginning of this episode, it's about telling people rather than building something with them. It's telling and it's dictating. And yes, there are absolutely brilliant frameworks like, as you and I discussed, Donald Miller's story brand framework that really shift the focus to the customer, but the problem is that mainstream marketers too often misunderstand and misuse the concept. They think that telling a story just means writing a longer caption about themselves. So, my question to you is, you use the term story building instead of storytelling. How does that one word change the dynamic of this entire thing? Does building really imply that the customer is holding the hammer with you?
So there are two sides of this. The first I find is that often storytelling is how can we put a nice new coat of paint on your story? So
Mm,
you're trying to better tell the story you're already telling. And
hmm.
often that story is, look how great I am. And then you sort of, well, we'll have a hook and we'll do it like this. And so storytelling is sort of a little bit putting lipstick on a pig kind of thing. And so story building, I concentrate way more on what story to tell than how to tell it. So yes, there are structures. All stories are formulaic and you have all these steps, and that's really important. But you have to know what to put in those steps. And it comes from taking your customer standpoint.
Mm,
So it's really this my story building method is a series of canvases, and the first one is all these questions about your customer. I say, forget your offer almost, because y- there's a kind of reflex action where companies will say, we have this product or service, so the problem must be that they don't need the product. The problem is that they don't have this my product.
right.
But often they think of it way differently,
Uh,
and you come in and help them. But if you can understand how they think and talk about the problem, I coached NGO that worked in water sanitation and basically keeping people from getting sick and dying. And normally you ship chlorine through trucks, bring chlorine to a place, and they put it in the water. And their system is they have an electrolyze and salt, and they create the chlorine locally. And I said, what is the problem you solve? And they said, well, not getting sick. And actually, when we dug deeper, they solved the fact that the trucks got stuck in the mud. They are
mm,
solving a logistic problem. They're solving this delivery problem. So,
mhm,
sure, at the end of the day, the whole point is for people not to get sick. But if you're talking to the people that are going to buy your service, in their
mm,
mind, what was keeping them up at night was the truck problem.
yeah.
And if you sort of say, hey, we have a way of helping you save people, well, yeah, that we do that all day long. But if you say,
Mhm.
hey, we get it, that this logistic problem is complicated, then they think, oh, they understand what I'm going through.
Yeah. Wow. I think that's powerful. And I think that's a really strong mindset shift for people, for marketers to really take a step back and recognize it from that standpoint, pun intended. But I think one of the really pitfalls that marketers need to really be aware of when it comes to storytelling, and this is, from my perspective, from my experience, when it comes to storytelling, there is a level of it that starts to become almost inauthentic because you are putting in so much effort to using the right words, to evoking the right emotion, and it starts to become really more of a controlled narrative, and it loses so much of that authenticity. And so when we start to talk about story building and we start to bring in different aspects of this where you give away a little bit or maybe a lot of that control and it make it more of this collaborative process where you take every aspect of the comprehensive story, the collective story, I think you start to gain back much of that authenticity that almost fights against some of those pitfalls of the concept of storytelling. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think you're completely right in the sense that often what happens is you jump way too early into, your offer. And so people are sort of, they're way out there looking in and not necessarily interested. So in my model, there's a first step that I call recognition, where it's really important for people to recognize themselves in your brand, offer, service, product.
Mhm,
If you walk down the street and you want to drink with a friend, you're going to walk by several cafes or things without even slowing down, and then one will suddenly be, "Ooh, that's for us." Um, and a lot of companies don't. They sort of say, "Hey, we do this stuff," and it's up to you to figure out if it's for you. But if you
mhm,
start a story by saying, these, you as this role, this identity, this have this aspiration and this challenge, and you sort of describe the person or the company behind the person, but there's always a
mhm,
person.
mhm,
um, they'll sort of feel, I mean, if I stumbled on a website that says I have a great service for independent consultants with a white beard and glasses, uh, I'll probably keep reading even before I know what it's all about, because I something,
mhm.
well, they work with people like me. They understand me. And somehow I feel already at the center of what they're doing, because they start
Right,
by saying, "Hey, I understand you." And a
right.
lot of companies skip that and jump in to say, "Here's what we can do for you."
Yeah,
But the you isn't quite defined.
right. Well, I think that this concept of story building comes at a really critical time in this development, this progression of the marketing landscape, because we're standing at a time where consumers almost are demanding being a part of that brand story. When we think about how consumers, and I've talked about this in a previous episode, what a lot of businesses do, the mistake that they make is they lead their strategy from a sales perspective. They approach the market with a sales strategy when consumers are responding to brand first strategies. They're responding to organizations that are bringing them into the story, that are bringing them into the experience. And so I think that your work and this concept of story building and how that builds into that is coming at a really critical time where marketers really need to understand how to shift the way that they're approaching growing their business.
I think so too. And I think it's um, when people are just saying, shouting out what they're doing, it's sort of each person in the company says something different, and it's all
Hmm.
about, they're just trying to shout the loudest. But they all start from a common story of a common customer, and they're
Right.
all talking about that. It's also a way that the whole company sort of suddenly focuses what they're doing on the customer.
Hmm.
When
Right.
my story is, I help people like you, well, everything I'm doing is about that. If my
Yeah.
story is about this is the product I deliver, then that product can go astray.
Hmm.
Oh, we should add some features or some things or something, but it's product first.
Right.
And when it's so I see a positive side effect when you go through these exercises, where teams come out sort of aligned on a thing, on a focus. Um, the other thing is, by default, companies are afraid to lose customers, so they
Mm.
try to be very broad,
Yeah.
and very broad becomes that no one is really interested. So if you
Right.
force yourself to say, we work with people like you with this kind of aspiration, this kind of challenge, well, you do narrow it down, and some people
Hmm.
won't recognize themselves in that. But the ones that do, sort of the whole thing starts your kind of pipeline with people that are really connected to who you are, what you do, who you help, instead of sort of this big mass of people that are indifferent.
Right.
Um, And so then when you do talk to them, they're already a little bit farther along that connection.
Well, let's take us a step back a little bit and talk about your agency and the story of how your agency got to this point, how it was developed. Because throughout this conversation, we have used the word standpoint a few times, not intending to use it in the context of your agency, but tell me a little bit about how you got to this point. How did you come to develop standpoint and really this concept of story building?
I love methodologies. I read all these books. I've tried all these canvases with a lot of post-its, and I've experimented a lot with companies, and I've found certain of these that bring out really interesting insights. Um, but they sort of all seem to come from a side angle.
Mm,
And so I started reading up on storytelling. A lot of those books are sort of a great blog post that were spread out over 300 pages. But and I did find Story Brand by Don Miller, and I started using that connected with other things, and I found that it forced people to decide. Often you talk to a company and you say, we do all these things for all these people, but when you have to write the story from your customer's perspective, you have to decide, well, who are we talking to? And that means you have to decide, who are we not talking to?
right.
Then you
Yes.
have to decide what's important, which means, well, what is important? Because often the other problem is you just sort of say, hey, we do this and we do that and we this and all of this, and we don't want to forget that we also do this, and then no one really understands what you stand for anymore.
Mm,
Um, and when you have to put it into that structure, it sort of clarifies your positioning, um, and then you can bring in all these other methods along the way. But it sort of is. I found out that was the core, and then little by little, I started building, tweaking existing methods and putting pieces together. I mean, this isn't something that is sort of crazy invention way out there that no one ever heard of. It's more the fact that it's putting together the pieces in the right order that forces companies or people to go through and reflect on these steps, and that even before you get the actual story, there's always already that positive thing of clarifying your vision, and yeah. So then, yeah, I played with different brands, and then at one point, years ago, I sort of said, what's the core of what I do? And it always felt like it was, you had to take the other person's standpoint. I mean, you have to have a strong standpoint yourself. The idea isn't
right.
to be
Yeah.
pulled around by what one client says and you change direction, but it's really about, yeah, this empathy, and so I like the word standpoint.
I think that's right. I think that's very good branding, because the word standpoint, it refers, as you said, it refers to perspective, which is so critical in today's ever-changing world, and it seems like the world changes day by day. So let's operationalize this a little bit for leaders who might be listening, because if I'm business leader, if I'm standing inside the factory, I see the product, right? If I'm standing inside the customer's living room, I see the problem. When you walk into a client engagement with Standpoint, what's the first clue that tells you that they're standing in the wrong place? How do you physically or mentally move a leadership team to see their brand through the eyes of their customer?
Um, so somehow there are kind of two types of company. There are some companies that want that go into the pure marketing route and saying we need a better story to better engage. I mean, somehow maybe the companies that need it the most are the ones that don't want the service, but
Yes,
there's
100%.
something. But and and then they're really focused on building a story that will structure their website, structure their pitch to their clients and things like that, because and it could be linked to a pivotal moment. It can be there's a merger, and so you have to clarify your positioning, a new product. It could be just like there's a growth phase, or even product differentiation, things like that. And then as we work, they sort of you slip in sort of this strategy, positioning, focus elements, and often there's this aha moment halfway through where they're focused on this pure marketing message, But then they sort of say, "Oh yeah, oh those are the people we're helping, or we're serving, and this is the thing, and this is how it connects." And that alignment of the team and that focus is already really positive, and then they get the message. And
Mm,
others, well, are a little bit maybe more mature and sort of say, "Okay, we need to do some strategy on our positioning and better understand our customers." And I sort of say,
mhm.
"Oh, great. I have the tool I use for that is storytelling. And what's great is at the end, you also get this great sort of foundational marketing message." So sometimes they get it doing it, learning by
Mm.
doing more than, I was so convincing in my sales pitch that they thought, "Oh, that's going to transform us." It was sort of like, "Okay, we're going to do this." And then they come out saying, "Ooh, damn, that really was impactful." So
Yeah.
that's always fun.
You alluded to something that I think is really important. I want to pull on it a little bit because it does relate a little bit to a core tenet of my consulting philosophy. You talked about kind of this alignment between the internal and the external aspect of storytelling. And so, in my work, I teach what I call an inside out strategy, but I'm not talking about navel gazing. I mean that you have to focus on the internal customer, which is the employee, before you can successfully engage your external customer, which is the customers in the market. And my central thesis is that you can't have high external engagement with your customers if you have low internal engagement with your employees. The employee experience eventually becomes the customer experience, but it has to start from inside the house first. In your story building process, do you find that this applies to the narrative as well? Do we need to build a story that sells the company to the people working inside the company first, or just as hard as we sell it to the people buying from it?
So it's the word sell. I'm not sure about sell, in the sense that what I find is that they build the story together, and there's a sense of ownership that comes along, um, more than, the management comes up with a story and says, "Okay, guys, this is the story we're going to use coming going forward." There's something about, they fight over, how do we define our customer, and this exercise to say, how do you describe your customer so that they recognize themselves, they think, "Oh damn, that's me." And so it comes out, you take all this kind of the front facing people that are either sales or the marketing, and that know, and sort of say, "We've had all these conversations, actually, that, talking like that clicks, that seems." But it's as much coming from them as how they project. I mean, you can always do market research and do customer interviews and actually, get some extra information. But I was always surprised how much information, how well they know their customers, but then don't use that knowledge. And
Huh.
it's sort of a way of and they always feel like that is a valuable feeling for them to
Yeah.
connect.
Yeah. Well, I like that you pick on the word sell because I think that is also a very critical shift in today's market. Just like we talked about a few minutes ago, cu- customers are responding to brand first, and branding is not about selling. It is about really more of that broader marketing experience where, again, it becomes about the experience. It doesn't become about the product, the feature, the benefit really,
Or the
but
logo and
really
the color.
correct. Yeah. So I love that you pick on that word sell because yeah, I think in today's market, to be successful in bringing and building not just a successful organization, but a sustainable organization, a sustainable business, you have to really shift that perspective of not approaching things from a selling point of view, but to a branding or to a marketing point of view. And this brings me really, throughout my experience, I've developed a framework for what I believe allows a business to not just be successful but sustainable. I use a Venn diagram to visualize the health of a business. And this diagram has three circles. So it has what I believe are the core foundations that allow a business to be sustainable but are the most misunderstood. That's leadership, marketing, and strategy. Now, when marketing, which is the story, and leadership, which is the values of the organization, when those two things overlap, you have identity or a misalignment in identity if those two things are misaligned. So if the external story is we're innovative and we're fast, but the internal reality is we're bureaucratic and we're slow, then the result is a broken identity. How does a broken external story damage that internal engagement? When an employee hears that the company is essentially lying to the market about who they are, what does that do to their trust and their willingness to engage?
Well, as you say, I mean, branding is every contact point. It's how you answer the phone. It's how you say hello when people walk in. It's whatever it is. And so that's how this story will come out on all those touch points. And so if you want a coherent identity, you have to have that shared story and also the shared values, and so that you come at it, from the same place, their heart is all in the same place. And so, if you sort of say, okay, now starting Tuesday, you have to smile, at least 12 times, when you're talking to a customer and this and that, and you sort of, fake the connection, people can feel that, and because the employees can feel that. And so,
Yeah,
so I agree. I think somehow for the brand to be authentic, it just has to permeate everything you do. And the
mm,
only way to do that is, bring everyone along for the ride.
absolutely. Well, I think what we're getting to here, what comes to mind is culture and culture building, right? When we talk about the difference between storytelling and story building, I think the idea of company culture or corporate culture really comes up for me in terms of the best example in the organizational context, because what we see a lot when it comes to culture building is leaders dictating what the culture in the organization should be, what they want it to be. But what really happens, the true outcome and the culture that develops in the organization is the result of the daily interactions, the daily behaviors, the daily experience that people are living. And I think that that so perfectly exemplifies the difference between storytelling and story building. Because when we talk about culture becoming a product of what is truly happening, how your internal customers, which are your employees, when we talk about how they are engaging with the leadership, which in this context is the organization, is the representation of the organization, that's what that disconnect becomes. So if as leaders of the organization, you're really intentional about that shared experience, as you mentioned earlier, that's the story building concept in action versus if as a leadership team, I'm standing at the top of the organization saying, you have to act this way, but then we don't act this way. Then there's that disconnect and there's that
Yeah.
discrepancy.
So, so I think story building is a part of that. I think culture is a complex phenomenon, and there's a lot of things that come in to do that. And I think a shared story and a shared way of sort of looking at yourself from the outside in goes a long way.
Mm,
I can't say that by coming in and doing storytelling, we're going to solve all the culture problems of a company, but it sort of is a piece that people can latch onto.
right.
And, you know, because it's a way of, for all those steps, you constantly flip it and say, how is that seen from the outside?
Mm,
Which means you start seeing yourself from the outside. Uh, Usually, you're sort of seeing yourself from the inside. Am I reaching my quota? And what is did I take too many coffee breaks or whatever? But I mean, but somehow, if the story is about the customer's experience, it makes a difference. So in this mezzo, that there was that first step of recognition where it's important that people recognize. And what's interesting is that you can choose who you don't, the customers you don't want to, so in some way. And then there's a second step, which is your offer, your solution. But it's especially, how are you different? What category do people put you in? They want to put you in a box. Clarity, values, trust, all these things. And companies sometimes aren't very good at that either, because you're different. You're not different because you have more widgets. You're different in how you help your customer You're different in how they experience, how you solve their problems. It's the difference that's important is the difference that impacts your customer. So
Mhm.
it's still a way of you're really good at, talking about what you do, but even then you have to sort of put it in the context of what category will they put me in, what difference, how am I unique, what is my standpoint on it. But then there's
Mhm.
a third step which I call projection, and again I think a lot of companies skip that, is they need to imagine what it's going to be like. And so, will it be easy to buy, to install, to set up, to learn, to use, to recycle, to this, to that? I mean, so I'm an independent consultant and I need a CRM. And I think I found one that's concentrated on independent consultants, so I've skipped all the ones that are for big corporations. I love their great features, AI this and automate that and stuff, and this is going to be great. But then I think, I'm going to have to copy paste from my Excel spreadsheet and find stuff in my emails and keep using my old system while I'm trying to understand the new system and stuff and things. And so I need to do this, but maybe next week. And then I don't come back. And so if you can, walk the customer through the whole cycle, this is how it's going to be. This is how easy it's going to be. This is how we're going to be there for you. This is how we're going to help you. This is how we're going to, this, this is how long it's going to take. This is the effort it's going to take. And then these are think of all these little problems that it's going to solve. And then imagine how your life will be better. And so if you can get rid of all these little obstacles of all these doubts that pop up, and then get them, closing their eyes and in the future a little bit, then they're really a few steps closer to engaging, because they can sort of say, oh, okay, I can do that. I can go there and I can, and I feel. But to be able to do that, you have to go through not only your product and the service and what it does, but how it's perceived, but then the whole cycle of how it's used and everything from your customer's standpoint. So suddenly, everything you do is suddenly flipped, where you take this outside in view, uh, which then feeds into your inside out, because it's a positive loop. Um, but yeah, so I think that is uh, connects with how people will then live this and what the brand is. And yeah, so that's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that you just described is exactly why I would argue that story building as a framework can be a solution, or at least a step to fixing this internal culture problem, or into developing more stronger or more positive cultures. Because again, as a part of my philosophy, I strongly argue, for business leaders to really shift their mindset and treat employees as their primary customers. And so, when you think about, what is your product then, if your employees are your customers, and the product is the culture, you are, again, for the lack of a better term, selling the culture. You're helping them to understand how working in your organization improves their lives, or allows them to achieve whatever goal they have in life. So, it's the same context, it's the same application. It's just a different, the data points are a little bit different, but the context of it and the application of it is exactly the same. And making that mindset shift as a leader changes the way that you approach how you treat your employees. And we all know that happy employees make for happy customers.
Yeah,
That relationship is inarguable,
yep,
right?
I agree.
And so, and because this is a season on engagement, I have to argue that point, strongly. But staying on that topic of internal engagement, I often see leaders in my work, and through the last 20 years that I've been in organizations, I've seen leaders treat engagement as a lever that they can just pull. But engagement is a relationship, whether it's engagement with your employees or engagement with your customers. It is first and foremost a relationship. It requires two parties. The employer has a role, right? When we're talking about the internal engagement, the employer has a role. They have to provide that clarity, They have to provide safety and a compelling narrative, which is again acting as that guide. But the employee also has a role. They have to actively participate and align their behaviors with that narrative. It's a two-way street. And again, this is true whether you want to look at it in the context of, the internal customer experience or the external customer experience. But, in staying with the internal engagement piece, how does having a clear, authentic brand story help define those roles? Does it make it easier for an employee to say, yes, I see where I fit in the story, or no, this isn't the story for me?
It can almost boil down to, individual decisions. If suddenly you're there with a client issue, if your story is how, your whole story is how you make their life better, well, that makes it a lot easier to decide what's best. If it's, all these vanity metrics or KPIs or things internally and things, and you think you need to 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 respect all these things, and you sort of forget the customer. And but I think happy employees make happy customers, but making happy customers makes happy employees. I mean, the fact that your job is to make customers happy
Yes.
is a fulfilling part of a job. I've done some workshops in hotel conference centers kind of thing, and several times there's something missing. There's the whiteboard pens aren't there, so you go out in the
Mm,
hallway and you grab someone, and some of them say, yes, so you go to the front desk and you can then ask, and then they'll find the right department to solve your problem. And then others say, I got this, no worries, I'll take care of it. And this person had nothing to do with the conference room, but that was the thing. And if you're going through life where you just try, you want to just do what is planned, instead of, okay, what is the whole goal of this place? Well, it's to make these, you know, this experience better. And that must be a lot more fulfilling for the employee too.
yeah, absolutely. Well, what you just talked about, brings me to another layer of how to apply your story building framework. I want to translate this concept into the individual career context. Just now, you talked a lot about, the employee and finding the sense of fulfillment in the work that they're doing. And I think that, when we pull this back into more of that career context, I absolutely feel like you can apply the story building framework to that as well. There's these three principles that apply whether you're running a Fortune 500 company or managing your own career. I often tell my listeners to treat their career as a business, to treat it as me incorporated. But just like the corporations that we critiqued earlier, I see so many professionals falling into the trap of career narcissism. They're focusing entirely on their resume, their needs, and their promotion timeline. But if an employee wants to truly engage and advance, how do they apply, the idea of what standpoint is about? How do they apply story building to their own career? How do they stop just telling their boss what they want and start building a story with them that aligns with the organization's goals?
So I've actually, applied this on all different levels, and I see it with like senior, ex-senior executives. So they had a great career and they had a big label. They were CFO, or they were C this or VP that or something, which was a function. And then they come out thinking, hey, I was so successful and earn a lot of money. Then I can go and do that as an independent consultant. And then it doesn't match up, because somehow it's less about the actual technical skills,
Mm,
and suddenly it was about all the other skills that were way more important, but
right.
weren't put up there in their label.
Yeah.
They were head of product or this or that, if you start digging into, what were your strong points? What were the things that energized you? What were the uh, what was fulfilling? Where did you really bring, make connections, bring these value in the context of finance or sales or whatever it was, um, to again say, what is this outcome that you're trying to promise as an individual, and that can be as an employee too. Who are your internal customers? What is what are their aspirations and problems, and how can you make their life better? And
Mm.
if everyone sort of takes those steps, it sort of piles up these stories. Um, there's always this kind of chain of value,
Yeah.
for even, could it be a product, a service, but also, the whole delivery chain and all these steps. Um, and Yeah, as a side project, I have a thing called Charting Your Retirement Journey, where we apply design thinking to your life. And it came out as a book last week. That
Mm.
wasn't the subject of today, but, but but somehow I'm finding that there's way more links between that and story building than I thought. I thought it was really two separate projects, because if you really want to build your self brand, you have to understand yourself and what is fulfilling. And if your goal is to be a happy employee, because then you'll make your customers happy. So how do you do that? Well, you have to understand, you know what what gives you energy and what drains you, what you're good at and what you're less, where this all happens. And maybe you need to take on a different role or change or grow, or you with this extra skill you can actually leverage all this good stuff, and
Right.
that's great positive for the company.
Hmm.
uh, and it's probably even more important nowadays, just as a survival skill,
Yeah.
because back in the day you sort of could sit in your chair all your life on the same company, and that's not the case anymore. I've changed
Right.
jobs 15 times. um, and so if you can build this brand, but brand in the good sense. There's this self-branding sort of hype out there,
Mm.
but to because just to recognize who you help and how you help them and how you make their life better and where your strengths are and how and all that. Well, that makes it easier to find other places where you can apply that, or just apply it even better where you are. um,
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit more about that book because, as you've mentioned, storytelling is a one is not or storytelling is often a one-way street while story building is collaborative. You talked about how this applies to our behaviors at work, and that you can't just communicate your value, you also have to align your behaviors with the people around you. But what you just introduced is this notion of really fulfillment and thinking about the end of your life and where you want to be, what you want to have accomplished, and how that relates to the actions, the behaviors that you're taking today. And when we talk about the topic of engagement, that's a critical piece for people to understand, right? And I talked about this with a previous guest, and I forgot what the book was, but he had talked about a book where they interviewed people at their deathbeds, and one of the most common themes that came up was that the biggest regret people have at the end of their life is not
Not
doing
reaching a
more.
sales quota, no.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, it's not it's that they didn't do enough meaningful work to feel like they were fulfilled at the end of their life. So tell me a little bit more about the work that you explored in this new book.
so so first of all, the end of your life is really far away somehow.
Yes.
So when you sort of, you've gone through your career, whatever career that is, there'll be a point that there's a whole other chapter there. Before it was sort of like, oh, I retired and then you had a vacation and then it was over. But now, I mean, there's the third of your life waiting for you. So if your whole identity boils down to your role at work, when that ends, there are a lot of people where that is really difficult. Before they were a leader, they were a manager, they accomplished things, and then suddenly gardening doesn't cut it. And their husband asked them to take out the garbage and stuff. That's and but we don't prepare for that. And but then if we need to prepare for that, well, I guess we need to prepare for what's before too. So it's sort of an ongoing thing where you're trying to build the the fulfilling life, the purpose. You like Venn diagrams. There's these three things, sort of what do I have fun doing, what am I good at, and what are people willing to pay for. But
Mm.
there's this thing about, so to really understand what drives you and what you um, often we talk about work-life balance,
Huh.
and I hate that.
Yeah.
It sort of feels like you have on a scale,
Mhm.
and if you have too much work, you have the only option is to work less,
Right.
and that's the only lever you have. If it's a balance, but so we came up with this vision where there's work, love, play, and um, work and work life play and one other. Anyways, so this idea that it doesn't add up to 100%. I can,
Mhm.
I work 50% and I'm fine, or I work 100%, I'm fine. Um, and how do I feel about and health, of course. So how do I feel about my health? How do I feel about my relationships with my partner, with my kids, with my friends, with my dog, whatever? And to understand. And I went through this and I felt, where's my play? I love my work and it's great. I have great relationships. I'm relatively healthy, I guess. Even if I don't go to the gym enough. And I realized, I bring play into work. These books and the things and working with crazy people, different stories every day. Um, but yeah, a lot of people have that kind of thing. There's work, and then there's their life.
Yeah.
And then at some point, you take off this whole big part. But if you're constantly building this good balance of all the things of life, and work is one of them, it's not opposed. um some people say, yeah, well, you know you can't like work because that's why it's called work, kind of thing. No, that's part of your life, and that's part of what you're doing.
Something that you kind of started to touch on was this difference between, living based on logic and living based on emotion. And I think that's a very critical piece when it comes to something like story building, because, it's the thing, the concept of work life balance to me is very logical. It's very logic based. It's not necessarily, or it's not very emotion based. But when we talk about, the context of business, whether we're selling a product or selling ourselves in an interview and treating our careers as a business, we often default to more of that logical thinking, resume bullet points, feature specs, but humans decide based on emotion. So if I were a listener who is, in a transition phase, or really trying to shift my perspective to think about my career as a business, how do I apply story building to how I approach creating this shared experience between myself and my employers? How would you help a serious professional, maybe an engineer or a financial analyst, find that emotion in their story without it feeling fluffy or unprofessional? Or how does that emotion come into the story building piece?
Well, first of all, I agree completely. We make decisions based on emotion, and then we rationalize. We find a reason that fits. We've already decided that's the car you want, and then you go make up that it was because of the mileage or whatever. And so in this story, a big part of telling the customer story is connecting with their emotions. So it's not that they have a problem. It's they're frustrated by this problem, or they're scared because of this problem, or something. And that part of your solution is to make them, you know, feel, feel a different emotion. Um, you know, if I mow lawns, I can say, "Hey, I can come and mow your lawn," or I can say, "Hey, you're really frustrated. You come home from work, you're tired, so you don't take care of your yard. It's a mess, and you're ashamed in front of your neighbors, and your spouse is always on your back. So I can come and do this great thing, and you have a beautiful yard. Imagine how you'll be proud, during that barbecue with your friends and family, and the coming home and just being able to, have that moment where you feel at home. It's still about mowing the lawn, but it's not mowing the lawn. It's going from it's this transformation, and everything we sell is a transformation.
Mm,
I'm not selling you a suit. I'm selling you the fact that you'll be a professional or whatever, kind of thing. And so if you can tap into that, um, you know, empathy goes both ways. And somehow by bringing this empathy towards your customer, you know, well, forces this mirror effect of empathy on yourself and how that makes you feel.
But as we get to the end of the episode, we have to really talk about the elephant in the room, which is generative AI. And generative AI can write a brand story or a cover letter or whatever in 10 seconds or less, but it will never have that emotional component. In a world where content is becoming free and infinite and fast, what happens to the value of a true story? Does AI make the human standpoint more valuable, or is it a threat?
So I think it's a trap in the sense that a lot of people will sort of default to saying, write my brand story. You sort of feel that when I said story building is sort of building this foundational structure of a story, and then you still have to go build your website or your pitch deck or the what you're going to say at the next networking event. And so Gen AI can be useful at that stage. It can help you build a better website or a better pitch deck or better write that little paragraph that you want in this corner. But it'll only do that well if you've done the work of knowing what you want to say.
Mhm.
And so the risk is that people are going to skip. I think
Right.
a lot of marketing has that risk of skipping the step. You go and
Mhm.
say, "Hey, well, I need a new website," and they'll say, "Hey, yeah, and we can do it like this, and I can blink and this and that and the other," without necessarily stopping to say, "Well, what do you want to say?" I mean,
Mm.
of course, the good agencies do ask that, but um, and Gen AI is the same. If you don't if you don't feed it, it's just going to come out with something very generic,
Yeah.
and so it's even more important. And so then you can maybe find a cute turn of phrase once you know what you want to say. Fine, um, but uh, but yeah, that's I think before people will just avoid doing it, and now they'll do the shortcut, and it's not
Mhm.
necessarily better.
Right.
Uh,
Absolutely.
you can read something and think, oh, that was really well written. But what did it say? uh, I saw this great stand-up comic that was able to do this 20-minute thing where it was a TED talk, but there was no content. And it really felt like that, like, oh, so this and that and the other, and go through all these things. And you think, a lot of the speech is that all these mission statements and vision statements where they're trying to build this culture around, and it's all
Mm.
about we want to be excellent. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, what does that mean?
What does that mean?
Um,
Mm. Yeah. Well, thanks, John. So, again, as we close the episode, we have listeners who are entrepreneurs and we have listeners who are employees. But regardless of their role, they can all improve their quote unquote standpoint. What's one question that they should ask their customer, whether that's a client or a boss, tomorrow to start understanding the perspective better? What's the one thing they need to stop saying?
so um, I sort of feel that they know it, and they just need to dig, because customers have been talking to them before. So it's really, I think that the step is to flip, to turn around and sort of see yourself from their point of view. What am I really looking? Why am I here? What am I looking for? What am I trying to accomplish? What's my problem? Why am I even on this website looking at this company? Um, and suddenly you'll be surprised how you think, oh damn, yeah, I mean, we talk about this, but they're coming with this rich need. um one, like, even come back to the networking event. If the kind of little tip is
Mhm.
uh, this idea to say, what do you do? Well, these people have this aspiration, but they're stuck with this problem. I
Yeah.
help them, and this is why their life is better. And often people only do the middle bit. This is what I do. But if you can get them to feel this empathy for these company people, whoever, and then imagine, oh yeah, and that's way more engaging just in a interpersonal thing, but it also forces you to say, well, who do I help and how do I make their life better? And if I can
Right.
start talking about myself in that way, I mean, not only will, I'll be more engaging during the cocktail part, but again, I'm starting to see myself from this outside of from who I'm their point of view, from
Hmm.
their standpoint,
Yeah.
your
Yes.
brand from their standpoint.
100%. Well, John, one final question. If you could leave our audience with one truth about the power of story to drive engagement, what would it be?
So do a little drum roll here. Um,
Brrr.
I think it's really this mindset shift. You know, I've seen so many people building these great things, and they're so concentrated on the thing. And suddenly, when they step back and take the other standpoint, you see the world differently, and that can become a almost a habit. When I go to buy my groceries and I talk to the cashier, for me, it's become a second nature. I mean, I do
Mhm.
this constantly. So I think she's been sitting there all day long with people going by on their phone and their thing. And so I'll stop and I'll ask her how her day went and talk to her because that's where she's or he is at. And so if you do that in your
Mm.
life, I mean, sure, with your customers, but you come home, and your spouse is in a bad mood and tired, instead of being angry, step in their shoes kind of thing. But
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. I think that's a great way to end the episode and leave people with something that they can, again, take action on and apply to their lives, whether it's in the context of their careers, in the context of their business. So, thank you for that. And thank you for this conversation. It has certainly been insightful. And I'm glad that somebody is challenging and maybe not challenging, maybe elevating this mainstream notion of storytelling that has become so much of a buzzword, really, and in a lot of ways, misunderstood and misapplied. So, thank you for crafting this new idea of really creating a shared experience and a shared story versus just a story that we dictate and tell to people. And thank you for allowing us to use a platform to spread that message.
well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Of course, if people want to work with you, if people want to engage with you and learn more from your standpoint, your perspective, what's the best way for them to do that?
So, again, I guess the center is always just my website, which is standpoint.ch. I'm in Switzerland, so it's .ch. And on that, you'll see a little bit what I do, access to to the book and things like that. What I can say is that if you go onto that website and go, scroll down to the contact form at the end, I didn't prepare something special for this podcast, but in the comment part, say, "Hey, I'm coming from Clarence's podcast, and I'll set up like an hour meeting where we can talk about your brand, talk about your situation, and get some already some highlights and some a little bit of mind shift." And then maybe we can work together. But you can come to me and we can already have a great conversation.
Perfect. And John, tell us about how to get a copy of your story building book and the new book. When does the new book become available if it isn't already, and how do we get a copy?
So the easiest is to go to Amazon. One is called Storybuilding. The other is called Charting Your Retirement Journey, or you can search under John Elbing, and they're available, on paperback. And there is an ebook, but it's there are worksheets and they're both workbooks and things. So that it's a thing where you open up on your computer and you can have it. It's not that one of those little Kindle where you read a novel, but you can have an ebook version. But yeah, so it's available on all the Amazon countries. In Europe, some people buy it on Amazon. Germany or France or this or that, the other, I guess. Uh, so yeah, that's how you do it. And but if you go on my website, you'll find links to getting the book, so that makes it easy.
Perfect. Well, we'll make sure to add all those links in the show notes. So make sure to check that out if you want to grab a copy of John's book, which you absolutely should. And again, John, I want to say thank you on behalf of our listeners for building your story with us here on this episode of the Align Engage Fulfilled podcast. And for those of you listening, thank you for joining us. And make sure to follow, like, rate, subscribe, and share this story to a marketer that you know. Share this story to a business owner that you know, because it can certainly help them change the way that they're approaching building that story with their customers. So thanks, John, for joining us today.
Thank you, Clarence. This has been a lot of fun.